Recently, there's been a lot of news on toxic workplaces. A lot of it has been eye-opening and jarring. And we are so happy that this is happening because this is actually calling out employers which need to change the way they speak, the way they act, and apparently the policies that run around the way that their teams work. But these incidents also got me personally to start thinking about maybe things that I have said or the way I have acted in the past. But then at the same time, organizations do go through pressure. There are up and down cycles. There are times that will be stressful for any organization and people will get pushed to their max potential. How do you balance behind not being a toxic workplace, but being a workplace that can still act and go through the life cycles of a business with ease and seamlessness? We feel that the answer actually for this lies in the messaging and the way that people act. Welcome today to our next episode of Consequence of a Message, where we peel back toxic workplaces and the messaging that may create them. Today on our show, we have Mayur, who's part of Ideosphere, and we also have Anuba. Anuba, welcome to the show. Anuba Duhan is a coach. She's also working with Northern Trust right now in the L&D department. But one of the things that you concentrate on is NLP, and you brought a lot of that skill set into the organizations that you've worked with. And I'm sure workplace culture, behavior, language is something that really takes a lot of your mind space when you're talking to leaders and how to lead good teams. Before this shoot, you were talking to me about radical candor, and I feel giving feedback is probably the thing that scares leaders the most. That I hope I can give feedback without stepping over the line. So how would you explain that? And you're telling me that radical candor could be a key to kind of unlocking that.
Very rightly said, Anirudh. The radical candor is one such shared framework or a language that I think in company it forms a culture, and I view culture as the operating system. Just as the operating system ensures that it runs in the background, ensures that the hardware, software is working all fine, removing inefficiencies. I also believe that culture is one such thing for any corporate. Um, and we have either the robust culture or we have so-called toxic culture, right? So if it is a robust culture, it is removing inefficiencies, it is ensuring that it's driving productivity, it is leading to team performance. On the other hand, we have toxic cultures, which is leading to which we can also say, because we are comparing it to operating system, it is more like a buggy system where there are bugs that needs to be fixed, and it's creating inefficiencies in the process. Now, I think to your point of radical candor and how it is placed, I believe like the system needs to be upgraded each time. And when we need to upgrade the system, we have representation of diverse workforce now. What we initially set as the foundations to start our culture might not support our systems and policies and the needs of the current generation. And therefore, there have to be patches like how we have an operating system. There have to be algorithms, there have to be need-based testing needs to be done in order to ensure that we have culture which is more robust in nature. And radical candor, I believe, is one such way to navigate through the channels of communication, creating open dialogue. It has four quadrants, of course, divided into two axes. So we have x-axis representing personally caring for people that you're working with, and the other is challenge. So when we challenge people directly, but we do not display any empathy or care, we are actually being operating in one zone. But whereas the mix blend or the mix amalgam of challenging directly and also personally care is the zone where most of the leaders in enterprise should be operating in. And that's what we call radical candor. So radical candor is the terminology used where leaders are able to demonstrate empathy, also challenge their people by giving them open feedback. Um, the underpinning of all of this is, of course, the organization values, mindsets, how would their philosophy that they would like to anchor this all on. However, in order to pass the information, in order to share something which is as critical as the feedback, I think there has to be a common language which drives that kind of awareness amongst all that are working together. It sets the tone for the culture. It sets the tone for the team performance and how they operate with each other, what kind of belief sets they have as the shared interest. So, yeah.
To kind of just ask a question to you as a follow-up,
Yeah.
you're essentially saying that if we are able to effectively demonstrate that
Mhm.
there is a huge amount of care and empathy towards our
Yeah.
teams, then we can be as straightforward in our feedback and it should be taken in the right way. In your case, what you're saying is
That's
ethical
true.
candor.
That's true.
That a lot of the feedback that we want to give is not taken well because the team doesn't believe that you're doing that in the best interest of them. So managers and leaders should not be diluting feedback.
Yeah.
They need to work on something else. And I think
Yeah.
that's an important
Yeah.
important observation
Right.
for us to look
Right.
at. In fact, one of the other things that we always also talk about is that how do we create spaces that are safe in organizations for people
Right.
where they feel at home, they feel that they can be free, but at the same time there needs to also be a space where people can actually go in and talk and openly express what they want to change, what's bothering them.
Yeah, I think just following from what Anubhav was saying, that when you give a feedback and it comes from a space of care, people will listen to that. But like any setup, there are rules to that space, right? And a lot of people think that, okay, this is a professional setup, so there are certain rules and you need to follow on to that, and that's how you deal with it. But when you come from a space of caring, and the care is defined, right? Because again, these are terms which are, they have different meaning for different people. When the definition of care is understood by everyone, like I was saying, it's a common language. Everyone knows when I say what I mean by care. That's the space where you were creating a safe space. Brave space, on the other hand, is a space where the speaker, knowing the norms of the place, still feels comfortable enough to challenge.
Mm.
I think a lot of organizations, while they create safe space, can create a space where nothing negative is ever spoken. A brave space is where things which are difficult, things which can have repercussions, are discussed, but within the boundaries of care. One thing that I would really want everyone to understand, that diluting feedback and changing feedback is, these are two different things.
Which brings us to an interesting point that when we are building organizations, a lot of times we are building frameworks for people to make decisions aligned with the business, right? So we keep talking about what do we want to sell, how do we do it, how do we do things differently? What are we really trying to create? We are creating a culture that while everybody takes decisions day in day out on the business, there is a certain alignment to how we take those decisions. Do we do the same thing for culture and values, right? Do we create that decision making framework for what we guide? And I say this because my own personal experience of when we started Ideosphere, one of the things that we were focused on was the business. We didn't define our values at that point of time. The values kind of evolved over time, which meant that every leader in the organization could be and act the way they felt was the best to get the outcome.
Mhm.
But now with these values and with a larger sense of purpose, we have a guardrail saying this is the fence that you have to operate within and yet do your job, right? And I think that has been an important aspect of setting that guardrail for us. And one of the other things is that language, tonality, volume, this is often taken as, oh, this is a toxic workplace because the my leaders yell at me or they don't use right language, etc., which is obvious. And for people who know me, I absolutely agree with it, and that's where it is. But I think there are also areas deeper than that. So, Anubha, what really goes behind that? And you spoke a little bit about mindsets, which is at the very core.
Yeah.
But between mindsets and the language, there are a lot of layers.
The-
What are those layers for an organization?
Right. So, before that, if I may ask you a question, Anirudh, you mentioned that it took you some time to realize that we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out our values, right? What was that time? What really changed that made you
I
go
went
back?
to Glassdoor and there was a review that said that Ideosphere is a toxic workplace and it pissed me off.
Right. So the crux of all of this is messaging. As we are growing, we see that many folks have joined us along the way. And the more bigger you are increasing in size, it's difficult to translate those values to every single one of them. And so it's truly important to define it in terms of, some people call it culture behavior, some people call it values, some people call it anchors. Whatever that philosophy and guideline is, it is to ensure that we represent that brand in the way we interact with each other, we make decisions, and we have a certain attitude towards things. As you mentioned, there are ways to achieve something which we often call what, but there are also ways how do we achieve them. The idea is not to get to the end goal. The idea is to get to the end goal with the right ethos. And that's where the value comes into the place, because now you want every single one of them to exhibit the behaviors that the company stands for.
Yep.
And to your question of what are all those layers in between, I think the whole idea is to equip our leaders. And here, leaders is not, I'm not using leaders as a word to represent any title, but every single workforce, irrespective of hierarchy levels. And I believe that all the leaders need to reinforce it in their system. Companies or startups or elsewhere, you will see that they have their values and some kind of nuggets all around their office spaces, right? That's a very subtle way of registering that message in people's brain. And it's guiding their subconscious or conscious to act in a certain way. So I think that's one. The other is, can we implement these things and translate all of this information through some kind of trainings, interventions, policies, procedures, sensitization, awareness, some kind of programs. And so you see all that happens. One of the programs that I think is across uniform is the induction onboarding, where it is very rooted in, I think, I don't know how to put it, but it's a very zoomed out lens. They're not talking about their day-to-day work in onboardings, in most of the onboardings. It is very much rooted in the values, what's the business, who are our clients, what is our philosophy, our story, our success footprints. And I think those are the ways you're trying to shift the mindset, you're trying to give them the skill sets, and also ensuring when they are in a certain space, they're reminded of it time and again. That's
In
the
fact,
message.
this onboarding phase is actually very important. In fact, we are working with a customer right now, for which we've defined some EVP and this thing. And one of their biggest asks is, okay, how do I live this EVP, and how do I live it in my onboarding? That's my first touch point, a new person that's coming in. And I think delivering values across the organization is very difficult, because it's not something that you can just say, right?
Yeah.
But Mayur, over the last 5-6 years that we've been really once we defined our values, how have you been able to do that? Because it's not something you can just say, right? So how have you been able to do that, reinforce it? So talk a little bit about that.
So I think one of the things that I would just want to talk about is we spoke about saints, or we talk about workplaces where there's a lot of shouting and yelling, which is creates a toxicity. Uh, but the start is what we don't say, and the not saying is also as big a message as saying. And I think, for example, at IDEOS here, we always said that we operate on trust. Trust is fundamental to us. But what we didn't say is we trust you in every mode. And that led to the infinite leave policy that he came up with. We trust our employees to take leave when they'll do. And the employees, trust the organization to believe them. So I think that's where the action and the non-action kind of goes together. And every time we do that, in fact, learning from our customers, us, we also look at being transparent as a thing. So we changed our recruitment policy. He said we're going to be absolutely transparent. So when we start the conversation with the candidate, we upfront tell them that this is the package. Right? It's not something a later conversation, because then they are free to make the decision whether they would want to proceed with the thing or not, whether they want to go ahead or not. I think the implementation of all of this comes from listening, not just to the employees, but also to the society in large. And a very good example of this is the hybrid working system that a lot of
You spoke about the norm evolution also.
a lot of workplaces are now currently looking at it. Pre-pandemic, hybrid was only for a few people. Post-pandemic, a lot of organizations realize that, hey, this is workable. If we trust our employees, this is workable, because there's a social norm change which has happened. So I think that's where the fundamental of what do we say really comes from is observing these social norms. How do we make it into part of a culture, and then create, like, Anubhav was saying, the guidelines and the policies for that.
In fact, one of the things that I feel now in hindsight, as I think about myself as a leader, that before there were always companies where somebody will tell you that, hey, you really need to have thick skin if you want to go into that company. And it was almost like an expectation saying, nee, that's how it is, that's how they work culture. I Today where I sit, and from the societal norm of where I have evolved in the society, I think that's unacceptable. And when you look at toxic workplaces, you said this, I think, before, that everybody's definition of what a toxic workplace is different, right? But as leaders, we need to be able to serve the most common denominator of our team, of where the sensitivities of how the lowest common denominator would actually be, how they would feel, what they're going through, the empathy part of it, and need to then deliver that across. And I think that's the most difficult thing, because most of the way that we act, few people will always agree with it and be okay. And sometimes we use that as a rationalizing, they don't have a problem. Why do you have a problem?
Right.
Well, no, actually, they don't have a problem because they're just used to it. You still, it is a problem. And where the lowest common denominator needs to be looked at, then that becomes a much more efficient, a much more honest, authentic, and a great place to work. I mean, that's what people are trying to go for, that tag anyways nowadays. But so I think that is where we are. And interestingly, we are a as Ideosphere, we work a lot with brands, but this conversation is so much about communications, and it's about messaging. We were in a discussion recently with a customer. I think based on how they are and how they work, we defined or articulated, really, because that's our work in messaging, what type of values they would have. And a question that came up is, hey, are these values differentiated enough? And that kind of bothered me, because a lot of times a brand is to differentiate, but when you're actually talking about values and communication, it has nothing to do with differentiation. It's about who you are. I mean, I'm not going to try to be and have different values than you. It is about how I live those values. And often a lot of the messaging that comes out when it comes to values is based on the outcomes of those values or outcomes of those business, like policies or rules and things like that. And one of the things is that while that's the end point of the messaging, and it could be that one policy somebody feels is a very toxic policy, and one the same policy somebody may feel, hey, this is aligned because it's aligned to our larger purpose.
Right. So when I look at organizations and I look at their values, one of the ways to pass that messaging is through the behaviors. Like,
Yep.
what do you do day in, day out? And I feel like that can be easily translated through your managers. Now, managers at whichever level, because they are the ones who can hold their team accountable to their actions, and the other way around. Their team can hold the manager accountable, because if it is a wider organization, so difficult to then track, monitor, evaluate every single one of them. And I think it has to start by I believe by running those manager tracks where manager role is of a lot more importance than just monitoring the work. It is also to ensure that we are creating next gen leaders that are aligned with organizational values. And I believe one of the ways is, which we have seen in the recent times, we glorify the grueling schedules of any organization. And we take pride in the way we are working hard and putting lots of our time. What's truly important to drive that kind of a messaging is our managers are equipped enough to say, perhaps it's not efficient. Uh, if it is a one-off and it's a project-based, still okay. Maybe you need to put more efforts because this is the first time you're trying something. But if it is something which is part of your day-to-day work and people are taking longer to do the work, I think managers need to be equipped in terms of what are they appreciating, what they're rewarding, so that everybody gets that messaging. So in wider organizations or small organizations, when we are growing our or evolving our product and we are evolving our team, it becomes truly important to see how can we translate this message in terms of our behaviors.
Yep.
It can't be a verbatim or a vision or a mission statement written somewhere. It has to come through very deliberate actions, what we are rewarding, what kind of feedback are we giving, what kind of trainings we are running in terms of the awareness, etc. So I think that's
So I think,
where.
and that also gives the perspective to way people look at.
Yeah.
I think whenever we are doing brand messaging, for example, it's always eye-opening for businesses that come to us. And when you have a conversation, like whenever we do, they talk about, oh, these are our USPs.
Right.
And one of the things that we often do when we are working on message strategy is say, okay, fine, why don't we go back to your customers and ask them, out of all the things that you said were unique about yourself, what are things that you are actually very different in,
Right.
and what are things that you're possibly better in? It's not different, it's better.
Yeah.
And it's kind of eye-opening for brands saying, oh, our customers believe this is not different, it's just better than others, and these are really the things that we should look at different. And I think from a messaging strategy view, I think teams which are focused on building internal messagings need to take a leaf out of this, of saying, if these are my values, go back to your teams and ask them, how do you feel we are living these values? Specifics.
Right.
I think substance is very important. Like you said, action. And I think messaging has to be the communication of those actions. So just saying that as an organization, we exercise empathy, we have candor, we have ownership. What the hell does that mean to you? Because the definition is different for different people. That's one. That's the top line of the messaging. But when you get lower, the messaging has to be actual evidences. And it may be eye opening for people who handle people function. I'm coming to you next because Mayur does that for us. That, oh no, we have this value, but we don't have enough actions under the value. How am I going to live with, or how am I going to be able to establish this value if somebody asks me, prove it? And Mayur, when you say Ideosphere is a great place to work, here's my question to you: prove it. And for that, what's your approach to ensure you have enough actions and reach message?
Yeah, great. I think let's start with one fundamental and that we believe here in Ideosphere is people practice is one function which should say the least but should be felt the most. And I think that's the message we want to,
I like that.
with our policies that we bring in at Ideosphere is we want to say the least, because the more HR talks, the more toxic the workplace is. I mean, I feel that way. You can't drag people into company picnics when they are not feeling up to it. Um, and I think that's where the real organizations who've put a lot of effort into people practice spend a lot of time in. They're sitting there and listening and listening and listening, and that's where they look at it. And I'm going to take few examples of what it really means is when we talk about transparency, right, as a value for us in Ideasphere. Every rejection email that we send out has absolute exact feedback on why the candidate was rejected. And I think any candidate who spent time investing through the process that we have deserves to know that, right? Yes, of course, we don't give out the exact things. In fact, you said prove it, and it's not a point of proving. I think we did get a feedback from one of the candidates on LinkedIn that this is the only company who's candidly and openly said that we cannot afford you, and they appreciate us for that, right? And I think that's that. I think the values once defined, and you were talking about, hey, defining is easy. How do you live it is very important, because then you have to find every step you need to run it through that lens. You need to run it through that filter that I said this, and is this action really meant for that? That's why I come back to everyone who works with people practice thing is talk less, think more. Is this take the time to process? Is this passing through that lens or not? Will it at any point of time be questioned? One of the things as people practice that while it's a norm, but I find a little challenging for people to do is put up their vision, mission, all of that, and plaster it on the wall, because that's almost setting yourself for failure. Because every time you're going to hit up, someone's going to point out that, isn't that what you mean? What are you doing that? Uh, so the more uh, quieter you are, that's where the real thing happens. Africans say, I think, tallest trees grow in silence. Yeah. And culture is one of those things. The message of silence can be very productive for an organization, but at times being silent on certain issues can also be very destructive.
So, one of the things that we are able to understand from messaging is the fact that it's not only about, and we talk about this often, but it's not only about the sender but the receiver. So how is that message going to be taken? And no matter how well intentioned it is, we must think about that, what's the risk or consequence of this message? What could be read differently into this message? A CEO came into a global company recently and put out a message that talks about the fact that, hey, the managers today are going to have to not reapply but reestablish why they should be in the job, which probably is because of global pressures, margins reducing. There's a lot of reasons that why that person must be doing it. But is that the right way to say it? What is going to be the consequence? Do you want your people to work in fear, or do you want your people to understand that we are going through a stressful time and there's going to be changes and we need to work together? Do you have a positive example, Anuva, from your just the fact that you have this practice of how a message can really lead to somebody looking at that as a north star and really changing the way that things work in an organization?
Right. So there is Copa Airlines example that comes to my mind. Their vision is 100% on-time arrivals, and what they did is they started simply by breaking that vision down into little practices and being very deliberate on it. I think so. One of the principles to operate from is being deliberate about your values. Two, what they did is they ensure that everybody is sensitized to know what it could look like differently in actions, and they celebrated the right thing. So when they are on time arrival is meeting the goal of the organization, they celebrated it across the board. So celebration is also one of the keys, I believe.
And just adding to what she was saying, right? It moves beyond just one function. For example, if you're talking already 100% on time, that means when you're hiring someone and you'll say, we'll get back to you by such and such time.
You live that.
I don't have to live that over there as there,
Absolutely.
because otherwise you're just living it in part.
Yeah.
And I think just going back to what I was saying earlier, right? Plastering your vision, it should it should not be a demonstration of this is what it stands for. In fact, it should be a gate pass for anyone to show us that mirror every time. And if you're ready to do that, then by all means you should go ahead and put that mission and vision and your EDP on the walls. Otherwise, it's just gonna.
But Mayur, do you also think that the values and how you stand for this, the messaging that you give out on this, does it need to be kind of control alt refreshed at certain points of time, because society is changing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to what Anga was saying, operating system, right?
Updated. You should have said upgraded or updated. Yeah.
Because think of it, a generation before us, our parents were always working hard.
They would appreciate.
They would appreciate it, right? They
Yeah.
had to work hard. Today we have AI, so we know we can get away from by not working hard because the hard work it can be done there. So what's the message now we need to deliver is different, right? And therefore, when you hear certain leaders coming out and say, "Oh, this is what you should do," uh, that was right. But the less today has shifted, and that is what I would invite all the organizations to look at. What does their messaging about their value really says? One of the messages that the values of the organization and how they live it can also be about resilience, because if they keep on upgrading and changing with time so that they are relevant, they are going to survive. They are going to be the company that people would love to work with.
Yeah. In fact, weirdly so, some weeks when it's a very horrible week, and I can really relate with this example, because imagine if I've worked for like 60 hours or something. It's been a tough week, like a bit long hours in office, and I go and tell my dad that I worked for 60 hours. He'll be like, good job, good work, working hard. I go and tell my wife, like, okay, I think you need to fix things. Something's wrong, right? Something's broken. Like, this is not how you should be. See how two different generations. One is taken positively, one is taken negatively. So at the end of the day, I truly believe that control alt refresh needs to happen at the right time, not too often, but not at the same time saying that we'll never change it. Also, what we need to understand by this is also that there's certain things when we look at, especially when you're looking at consequence of the message, which is what we are talking about here, and bringing it back to how messaging leads to this. I think a lot of times it's not that the message is toxic, it's that you're not living up to the message. That's what makes it toxic. And so the message in this particular case is really about actions, then the language, and then what you're saying. So if your messaging is clear and you're able to live up to it, then that will lead to a very healthy workplace. And if you're not able to live up to it, it won't. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that don't be in a rush to have many values. Don't be in a rush just to talk about values in the sense of this is the word and this is what we stand for. Define it for yourself, because every value that you make is a promise that you will be evaluated by to either label you as toxic or healthy.
Yeah.
And organizations must ask themselves, how many promises do they want to make? Because the difference between a healthy workplace and a toxic workplace isn't that you do everything for everyone, is that whatever promises you make, you hold yourself accountable to it and you show the actions. This delta really defines whether you are going to be a toxic workplace or whether you're going to be a healthy workplace, which means that delta needs to be communicated through actions. So this is where continuously going back to your team to understand, are you living those values, is very important. Having brave spaces for people to come and challenge you is also very important. And I think that just like any organization and just like any person, you're going to falter on your values at some point of time. You're going to make mistakes and you're going to stumble on those values. But the real litmus test is that the times that you stumble on your value, have you built your purpose? Have you built and driven your promises in such a way in the past that a team member who's exposed to that stumbling of the value feels, I want to come into that brave space and tell you and challenge you to change? Or do they feel more comfortable going to the safe space of social media and saying, this is how this workplace is? That is the consequence of what could happen, and which is where it really starts with one, what you believe in, the messages and the actions. We hope that in the future organizations really understand and become more healthier, accepting and inclusive spaces to work. And this will only happen when at the core, one, they're honest with themselves, two, they're able to articulate and then drive those into actions and create brave spaces for people to challenge them. This creates healthy workplaces. So, no, it's not about diluting feedback. It's not about avoiding feedback. It's not that leaders have to walk in fear. In fact, leaders should walk confidently, knowing that I'm held with all the guardrails that I've built in terms of the values and purpose that we built, that we believe in, and that we act out every day. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Consequence of a Message. See you next time.